Reality fractured above the hive world of Mortis Prime, a jagged wound in space that bled impossible energies across the ash-choked sky. The Adeptus Mechanicus cogitators screamed warnings as dimensional barriers collapsed, their machine spirits shrieking binary cant prayers to the Omnissiah. Tech priest Dominus Zereth watched from his observatory tower as something fell through that cosmic tier, trailing emerald fire like a comet of pure rage. Have you ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Well, we're about to find out, because today we're dropping the Hulk into the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40,000. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at either franchise the same way again. But before we dive into this absolute chaos, let me paint you a picture of just how insane this scenario really is. We're talking about taking Marvel's strongest Avenger, a being whose power literally has no upper limit, and throwing him into a universe where entire planets are sacrificed daily just to keep humanity's dying empire alive. This isn't just a thought experiment, this is a recipe for dimensional catastrophe. In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what would happen when the Hulk's unlimited rage meets the endless war of the 41st millennium. We'll explore how the Imperium would respond, what the forces of chaos would make of this gamma-powered anomaly, and whether the Hulk could actually survive in a universe where hope itself is considered heresy. I've spent weeks researching both universes, cross-referencing power levels, and mapping out the most likely scenarios. What I discovered will absolutely blow your mind. The impact crater stretched for kilometers across the industrial wasteland of Mortis Prime's northern continent. Where manufactorums had churned out weapons for the Emperor's endless wars, now only twisted metal and glass remained. At the center of this devastation, something stirred, something green, something very, very angry. Dr. Bruce Banner had been working late in his laboratory when the dimensional rift opened. One moment he was analyzing gamma radiation readings from a recent Hulk transformation. The next he was falling through a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and geometries that made his scientific mind reel. The transition between realities had been violent, traumatic, and Banner felt that familiar heat building in his chest as he struggled to comprehend what had happened to him. The air on this new world burned his lungs. It tasted of industrial chemicals, human suffering, and something else, something that seemed to whisper directly into his mind with promises of power and corruption. Banner's heart rate spiked as he took in his surroundings. Towering spires stretched into a sky the color of dried blood. Massive Gothic structures loomed in every direction, their architecture somehow both magnificent and oppressive. The very stones seemed to weep. This wasn't Earth. This wasn't anywhere in his reality. And as Banner's scientific mind began cataloging the impossibilities around him, that familiar green tinge crept into his vision. His pulse hammered against his temples. The other guy was waking up. High above in the command spire of Hive Tertius, Governor Malthius received the first reports with typical Imperial efficiency: an unidentified impact in Sector Gamma 7, probable meteorite, minimal strategic value. He was about to dismiss the incident entirely when Astropath Valen burst into his chambers, her psychic third eye weeping blood. "My lord," she gasped, falling to her knees. "The Emperor preserve us. Something has awakened, something filled with rage beyond mortal comprehension. The warp itself recoils from its fury." Governor Malthius had ruled this hive world for 30 years. He had seen orc invasions, chaos cults, and tyrannid infiltrator organisms. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what his orbital surveillance feeds were about to show him. In the crater, a figure was growing, not just in size, but in presence. The very air around it shimmered with barely contained violence. Banner tried to maintain control as he had learned to do over the years. Deep breaths, count to 10, think of Betty, think of science. Think of anything except the growing certainty that he was trapped in some kind of nightmare dystopia where human life held no value whatsoever. But as he watched a group of figures approaching across the wasteland, his control began to slip. They moved in perfect formation, their black armor gleaming despite the ash that fell like snow from the polluted sky. Adeptus Arbites, though Banner had no way of knowing that term. To him, they looked like fascist stormtroopers, their faces hidden behind skull-shaped masks, their weapons aimed directly at him. When their leader spoke, his voice was amplified by a vox grill, turning his words into a mechanical growl. Unidentified mutant, you are in violation of Imperial law by existing. Submit to immediate termination or face the consequences. Banner raised his hands, trying to look non-threatening despite his torn clothes and the fact that he was standing in the middle of a crater that his arrival had created. Please, I don't want any trouble. I'm not even supposed to be here. There's been some kind of accident. The Arbites leader tilted his head, and Banner could see the red glow of augmetic eyes through the skull mask's sockets. Mutation detected. Xenos contamination possible. Purification protocols authorized. The first shot took Banner in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the twisted remains of a manufactorum wall. Las fire erupted from a dozen weapons, scorching the ground around him as he struggled to get back to his feet. Pain flared through his nervous system, followed immediately by something much worse: rage. You don't understand, Banner shouted over the crackling energy weapons. You need to stop shooting at me. You really need to stop. But the Arbites had their orders. In the Imperium of Man, mutation was heresy. Heresy was corruption. Corruption was death. They increased their rate of fire, las beams searing through the toxic air as they sought to end this threat before it could spread whatever taint it carried. That's when Bruce Banner died, and the Hulk was born into Warhammer 40,000. The transformation was unlike anything the Imperium had ever recorded. Flesh expanded at an impossible rate, muscles growing and hardening into living armor that turned aside las fire as if it were gentle rain. The creature's roar shattered windows in hab blocks kilometers away and sent seismic tremors through the hive's deepest foundations. When it stood at its full height, the Hulk towered over the Arbites like a green giant of pure destruction. Hulk smash metal men. The first Arbites never saw the fist coming. One moment he was firing controlled bursts from his combat shotgun, the next he was a red smear painted across the side of a ruined building 300 meters away. His squad mates opened up with everything they had, bolt rounds and plasma shots that would have reduced a space marine to component atoms. The Hulk didn't even slow down. What happened next would be remembered in Imperial records as the Mortis Prime incident, though most of those records would be classified at the highest levels or simply destroyed. The Hulk moved through the Arbite squad like a force of nature, each swing of his massive fists creating sonic booms that shattered nearby structures. Their weapons, designed to stop the most dangerous criminals and mutants in Imperial space, barely scratched his gamma-irradiated hide. In the command center of Hive Tertius, Governor Maltheus watched the massacre unfold on his tactical displays. The creature moved with impossible speed for something so large, bounding across the wasteland in leaps that covered kilometers. Wherever it landed, destruction followed. Industrial complexes that had stood for millennia crumbled under its assault. Even the sacred manufactorums blessed by the Adeptus Mechanicus proved as fragile as parchment before its rage. "Sir," his communications officer reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "we're receiving emergency transmissions from all sectors. The creature is moving toward populated areas. Current trajectory suggests it will reach the outer hab blocks within the hour." Maltheus closed his eyes and made the calculation that every Imperial governor dreaded. How many lives was he willing to sacrifice to contain this threat? The outer habs housed nearly 50 million citizens. The middle levels contained twice that number. And if this thing reached the upper spires where the nobility dwelled, "Activate orbital defense protocols," he commanded. "Authorization Maltheus Omega-7. Target the creature with everything we have." High above Mortis Prime, defense satellites that had guarded the world against invasion for centuries turned their weapons toward the planet's surface. Lance batteries designed to pierce the hulls of battleships focused their targeting arrays on a single green figure rampaging through the industrial wasteland. Macro cannons loaded with shells the size of hab blocks prepared to fire. The first orbital strike hit the Hulk square in the back as he was in the middle of hurling a Lehman Russ battle tank at a fleeing PDF squad. The lance beam, hot enough to melt adamantium, washed over him in a torrent of coherent energy that turned sand to glass and metal to vapor. For a moment, the defenders of Mortis Prime dared to hope. Then the smoke cleared, and the Hulk was still standing. His skin was smoking, blackened in places, but already regenerating at a visible rate. The creature turned its burning gaze toward the sky, and those watching from the orbital stations swore they could feel its hatred reaching up through the void to touch their souls. Hulk hate flying metal things. What followed was a display of power that defied every law of physics the tech priests held sacred. The Hulk crouched, muscles coiling like springs, and launched himself skyward. Not in a graceful arc, but straight up like a green missile of pure fury. The atmosphere screamed around him as he accelerated past the sound barrier, past any reasonable limit, climbing toward the orbital defense grid with nothing but rage and gamma radiation to sustain him. On defense platform Tertius, weapons master Corvus watched his auger displays with growing disbelief. The creature was actually reaching orbital altitude, its trajectory taking it directly toward his station. He ordered all weapon batteries to target the ascending threat, but tracking something moving that fast proved nearly impossible for even blessed machine spirits. The Hulk struck defense platform Tertius like a meteor of living muscle and bone. The impact sent shockwaves through the massive structure, buckling armor plating and shattering viewports that had been designed to withstand the fury of void warfare. Corvus had just enough time to whisper a prayer to the Omnicia before a green fist punched through the reinforced blast doors of his command center. What happened next, aboard that orbital platform, would become the stuff of nightmares for the survivors. The Hulk moved through corridors designed for normal-sized humans like a green hurricane of destruction. Blast doors meant to contain hull breaches crumpled like paper. Weapon systems that could level continents were torn apart with bare hands. And through it all, the creature's roar echoed through the station's halls, a sound of such primal fury that even hardened Imperial Navy veterans wept to hear it. But this was only the beginning. As the Hulk's rampage continued aboard the orbital platform, his actions were being monitored by entities far more dangerous than any Imperial governor or tech priest. In the Immaterium, in that churning hell sea of emotion and thought that lay parallel to reality, something stirred. The warp itself was taking notice of this new player, this being whose rage burned brighter than dying stars. Deep within the Eye of Terror, Khorne, the blood god, felt the Hulk's fury resonating across dimensions like a war horn sounding in the distance. Here was rage in its purest form, violence without restraint or compromise. The Skull Throne trembled with anticipation as the Chaos God contemplated what such a being might become if properly corrupted. On Mortis Prime below, Astropath Valen screamed as psychic shockwaves from the orbital platform's destruction crashed over her like a tsunami of pain and terror. In her mind's eye, she saw visions of what was coming, fleets of starships converging on their world, space marines in power armor the color of dried blood, inquisitors with eyes like winter storms, and behind them all, something vast and hungry stirring in the warp's depths. The Imperium had rules for dealing with threats beyond their comprehension. When conventional weapons failed, when orbital bombardment proved insufficient, when the very presence of a creature threatened the stability of Imperial space, there was only one response left: exterminatus. The complete annihilation of an entire world to prevent whatever corruption it harbored from spreading. But could even planet-killing weapons stop the Hulk? And what would happen when other factions of the 41st millennium learned of this gamma-powered anomaly? The Orcs would see him as the ultimate expression of brutal strength. The Tyranids would seek to devour and integrate his unique biology. The Necrons would analyze him as they had analyzed and catalogued every other species they had encountered in their 60 million year sleep. And in the deepest vaults of Terra, sealed behind wards that had held for 10,000 years, something ancient began to stir. The Emperor himself, master of mankind, psychic god of the human species, felt a disturbance in the warp unlike anything since the Horus Heresy. A new player had entered the great game, one whose power defied classification and whose very existence threatened to upset the delicate balance that kept humanity clinging to survival in a hostile galaxy. The Hulk had arrived in Warhammer 40,000, and the universe would never be the same. As the orbital platform's wreckage spiraled toward Mortis Prime's surface in a cascade of burning metal and venting atmosphere, the Hulk rode the largest fragment like some primordial god of destruction. The impact created a secondary crater that dwarfed his original landing site, sending tremors through the planet's crust that registered on seismic equipment continents away. When the smoke cleared, the green giant stood amidst the devastation, his rage undiminished by his journey through the void. But something had changed during his brief exposure to the vacuum of space. The warp energies that permeated this reality had begun to seep into his gamma-irradiated cells, creating mutations that defied both human science and imperial understanding. His already incredible strength was growing, fed not just by anger now, but by the raw psychic potential that flowed through the immaterium like blood through veins. On the bridge of the Imperial Navy cruiser Righteous Fury, Captain Thaddeus Kane received the astropathic message from Mortis Prime with the stoic resignation of a man who had served the Emperor for 40 years. The words burned themselves into his mind like brands. Unknown Xenos entity, orbital defenses compromised, request immediate intervention, the Emperor protects. Kane had seen worse, or so he told himself. The Tyranid splinter fleets, the chaos incursions that turned loyal Imperial citizens into gibbering madmen overnight, the orc wargs that swept across entire sectors like green tides of destruction. But as he studied the fragmented Pict captures transmitted from Mortis Prime, something cold settled in his stomach. This creature moved like nothing in his experience. Its power seemed to grow with each act of violence, each moment of fury feeding into the next, like a perpetual engine of destruction. "Prepare the exterminatus warheads," he commanded, his voice cutting through the bridge's controlled chaos. "If conventional weapons cannot stop this thing, we will deny it a world to ravage." His weapons master, a grizzled veteran named Corvin, hesitated at the controls. "Sir, Mortis Prime houses nearly 200 million Imperial citizens. The manufactorums alone produce enough weapons to supply 3-sector battle groups." Kane's jaw tightened. The calculus of Imperial warfare was always brutal, but this felt different somehow. More final. Better 200 million dead than whatever this creature might become if left unchecked. The Emperor's mercy is swift death, not slow corruption. But even as the cruiser's cyclonic torpedoes armed themselves in their launch tubes, other forces were converging on the beleaguered world. In the webway, ancient paths that connected distant points in space, through dimensions beyond human understanding, something stirred. The Eldar had felt the Hulk's arrival like a discord note in the symphony of fate, a wild variable that threatened to unravel carefully laid plans millennia in the making. Farsia Iandan of Craftworld Ulthway stood before the dome of crystal seers, her witch sight piercing the veils of probability to glimpse potential futures. In every strand of fate she examined, the green giant's presence created cascading waves of change. Worlds burned, stars died. The delicate balance between disorder and chaos shifted doom ways that cool, not just humanity, but every sentient species in the galaxy. "The skein of fate tears around this being," she whispered to her fellow seers. "He is unbound by destiny, immune to prophecy. Where he walks, the future becomes fluid." Meanwhile, deep in the Eye of Terror, where reality bent to the will of the Chaos Gods, a very different kind of attention was focusing on the Hulk's rampage. Khorne leaned forward on his brass throne, the skulls of 1,000,000,000 slain warriors crunching beneath his armored feet. The blood god's eightfold gaze pierced the barriers between dimensions, studying this new source of such exquisite violence. Mortal fury made manifest. The daemon god rumbled, his voice shaking the foundations of his brass citadel. But what manner of mortal can rage with such purity? What being can sustain such wrath without burning itself to ash? Already, the Hulk's continued rampage was having effects beyond the physical. Each building he destroyed, each life he inadvertently ended, each act of destruction fed psychic energy into the warp. But unlike the focused hatred of a Khorne berserker or the calculated violence of a world-eater's space marine, the Hulk's rage was something else entirely. It was primal, unfiltered, and growing stronger with each passing moment. On Mortis Prime, the local PDF forces had given up any pretense of engaging the creature directly. Instead, they focused on evacuation efforts, herding millions of terrified civilians toward transport ships and underground bunkers. But the Hulk's path of destruction seemed almost random, driven by whatever caught his attention in the moment rather than any strategic objective. He had discovered the Hive City's main arterial highway, a massive elevated roadway that carried millions of vehicles daily between the industrial sectors and residential zones. The sight of the endless stream of traffic seemed to trigger something in his gamma-addled mind, a memory perhaps of rush-hour gridlock on a distant Earth. His roar of frustration shattered windows for kilometers in every direction. What followed was a display of strength that redefined the word impossible for every Imperial observer. The Hulk grabbed a section of the highway's support structure, adamantium beams thick as hab blocks that had been designed to support the weight of entire city districts. With a sound like reality tearing, he ripped them from their foundations and began hurling them like spears at anything that moved. A convoy of Chimera APCs, racing to evacuate a noble family from the upper spires, found themselves under bombardment from projectiles moving at supersonic speeds. The vehicle's armor, blessed by tech priests and reinforced with faith as much as ferro-steel, crumpled like paper cups. The surviving crew members stumbled from the wreckage, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. But the Hulk's rampage was beginning to attract attention from sources far more dangerous than local PDF forces or orbital defense platforms. In the depths of space, a ship unlike any in the Imperial Navy's records translated from the warp with a sound like screaming metal. Its hull was black as the void between stars, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly. This was the Conqueror, flagship of the World Eater's Space Marine Legion, and it brought with it a cargo of violence that made the Hulk's fury seem restrained by comparison. Angron, the Red Angel, Primarch of the World Eaters and Daemon Prince of Khorne, stood upon his command deck and gazed down at Mortis Prime with eyes that burned like dying suns. The Butcher's nails, archaeotech implants driven into his skull during his youth as a gladiator slave, sang with pleasure at the psychic echoes of the destruction below. Here was rage that matched his own, violence that called to the berserker's soul he had never been able to escape. "Prepare drop pods," he commanded, his voice a growl of barely contained bloodlust. I would meet this warrior face to face, test his strength against mine. His subordinates, Khorne berserkers, whose sanity had been sacrificed long ago on the altar of eternal war, howled their approval. They had spent centuries searching for worthy opponents, beings who could match their fury and provide the kind of battle that would please their patron god. Now fate had delivered such a foe directly to them. The drop pods launched like crimson tears falling from the eye of an angry god, each one carrying a squad of the most violent warriors the galaxy had ever produced. As they burned through Mortis Prime's toxic atmosphere, their occupants chanted litanies of slaughter in voices that had forgotten how to speak words of peace. The first pod impacted less than a kilometer from the Hulk's current position, driving itself deep into the ferrocrete like a crimson fist punching through reality. The doors blew outward with explosive force, disgorging 8 figures in power armor the color of dried blood. They moved with inhuman speed, their chainswords already revving as they sought their first victims among the fleeing civilian population. But before they could begin their traditional massacre, a shadow fell across them. The Hulk had noticed their arrival, and something about these new warriors triggered memories buried deep in Banner's subconscious. Red meant danger, red meant violence. And violence meant things that needed to be stopped. The lead berserker never saw the boulder coming. One moment he was raising his chainsword in salute to the blood god, the next he was paste decorating the side of a collapsed manufactorum. His squad mates roared in approval rather than dismay. This was exactly the kind of worthy opponent they had hoped to find. What followed was the first true test of the Hulk's power against the forces of chaos. The Khorne berserkers moved like crimson lightning, their enhanced physiology and millennia of experience making them deadly beyond mortal comprehension. Their chainswords screamed as they bit into gamma-irradiated flesh, actually managing to draw the first blood the Hulk had shed since arriving in this reality. But pain only made him angrier. Each wound inflicted by blessed chainblade or daemon weapon fed the rage that powered his impossible strength. The berserkers found themselves facing something their combat doctrines had never prepared them for, an opponent whose power actually increased in response to injury and pain. The battle raged across several city blocks, reducing centuries-old structures to rubble in minutes. The Hulk's fists met chainswords in showers of sparks and gore. Power armor that had withstood the fury of alien wars cracked and shattered under impacts that registered on seismic equipment continents away. And through it all, the psychic resonance of pure violence echoed through the warp, calling to every servant of the blood god within 100 light years. In his brass citadel, Khorne watched the battle with growing interest. This green giant fought with a purity of purpose that impressed even the god of war. No strategy, no tactics, no consideration for collateral damage or personal safety. Just rage made manifest, fury given form and set loose upon the galaxy. It was beautiful in its simplicity, terrible in its power. But the Hulk was not the only one drawing attention from the forces of chaos. In the warp-touched realm where Tseentch, the changer of ways, plotted his endless schemes, crystalline towers shifted and reformed as the great conspirator contemplated this new variable. The Hulk's presence had introduced chaos into carefully laid plans, unpredictability into equations that had been balanced for millennia. Interesting, the Lord of Change mused, his voice echoing through dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend. A force of pure reaction, immune to foresight and planning, such a being could serve, or it could ruin everything. On Mortis Prime, the battle between the Hulk and the Khorne berserkers reached its crescendo as Angron himself descended from the sky on wings of brass and flame. The Daemon Primarch's arrival sent shockwaves through the planet's crust, his presence alone enough to drive lesser beings to madness. But as he looked upon the green giant standing amidst the wreckage of his elite warriors, something like respect flickered in his burning eyes. "So," Angron rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of unending war, "you are the one who has caught my master's attention. You fight well for a mortal." The Hulk turned to face this new challenger, his rage-filled mind struggling to process the sheer presence of the being before him. Here was something that radiated violence like a sun radiated heat, a creature born from humanity's capacity for war and refined into its purest essence. "Hulk strongest there is," he roared, his voice shaking dust from ruined buildings. "Green man smash red demon." Angron's laughter was the sound of armies dying, of worlds burning, of civilizations falling into darkness. "We shall see, Green One, we shall see." The collision between Angron and the Hulk sent seismic waves rippling across 3 continents. Where the Daemon Primarch's chain axes met gamma-irradiated flesh, reality itself seemed to buckle under the strain. The Hulk's massive fists hammered against power armor forged in the warp's deepest furnaces, each impact creating sonic booms that shattered every piece of glass within a 100-kilometer radius. But this was no ordinary battle between titans. As the two beings of pure violence clashed, their conflict began to tear at the very fabric of space-time. The warp bled through into real space around them, creating pockets of impossible geometry where the laws of physics held no sway. Daemon flames wreathed Angron's weapons while the Hulk's skin began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with gamma radiation. Tech priest Dominus Zeroth watched the battle unfold through his orbital observation platforms, his augmented mind struggling to process the data streams flooding his consciousness. Every sensor array registered readings beyond their designed parameters, energy outputs that should have been impossible, matter displacement that violated the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. And beneath it all, a growing psychic resonance that made his mechanical components spark and his few remaining organic neurons scream in harmony. "By the Omnissiah's blessing," he whispered through his Vox grill, "what manner of beings are these that they can reshape reality through pure force of will?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Deep within the Mechanicus archives, ancient data cores that had remained sealed since the dark age of technology began to activate. Information flooded through blessed circuits, knowledge that had been forbidden for millennia suddenly becoming accessible. The machine spirits whispered of experiments conducted in humanity's golden age, of attempts to breach the barriers between dimensions, of weapons designed to harness the raw power of human emotion itself. But the tech priests were not the only ones taking notice of the dimensional disturbances. On distant craft world Ulthway, the Infinity Circuit itself began to sing with alarm. The souls of billions of dead Eldar, preserved forever in crystalline matrices, felt the approaching storm. Farseer Iandan collapsed before the dome of crystal seers as visions of possible futures crashed through her consciousness like a psychic tsunami. She saw worlds consumed by green fire. She saw the Hulk's rage spreading like a virus through the immaterium, corrupting daemons and driving the Chaos Gods themselves to new heights of fury. She saw Space Marine chapters falling to madness as they tried and failed to contain this gamma-powered anomaly. Most terrifying of all, she saw the Emperor himself stirring upon his golden throne, his attention drawn to this new threat that defied all attempts at classification or control. "The Monkey have unleashed something beyond their comprehension," she gasped to her fellow seers. "This creature's rage is not bound by the normal limits of emotion. It grows stronger with each moment, feeding upon itself in an endless cycle of fury and destruction." On Mortis Prime, that fury was reaching levels that threatened to tear the planet apart. Angron's assault had only served to make the Hulk angrier, and with each passing second, his strength increased exponentially. The Daemon Primarch found himself being driven backward, his ancient weapons barely able to penetrate skin that had been hardened by exposure to forces beyond mortal understanding. "Impossible," Angron snarled, his voice distorting as the butcher's nails in his skull overloaded from the sheer intensity of the combat. "No mortal can match a Primarch's strength. No being of flesh and blood can stand against a servant of the Blood God." The Hulk's response was to grab Angron by the throat and hurl him through the upper levels of 3 separate hive spires. The Daemon Primarch's trajectory carved a path of destruction through residential sectors that housed millions of Imperial citizens, each impact creating explosions that could be seen from orbit. When he finally came to rest in the ruins of a cathedral dedicated to the God Emperor, Angron found himself looking up at a being whose power seemed to defy every law of the universe. But the battle had attracted more than just the attention of Chaos forces. High above Mortis Prime, reality rippled as massive ships translated from the warp with the distinctive energy signatures of the Adeptus Astartes. The Blood Angels chapter had received the astropathic distress calls, and Chapter Master Dante himself led the response force. Behind his golden death mask, the ancient Space Marine's face was grim with determination. "Brothers," he spoke across the Vox network to his assembled warriors, "we face an unknown Xenos entity of immense power. Standard protocols may prove insufficient. Prepare for close." The drop assault with extreme prejudice authorization pods that launched from the Blood Angels strike cruisers were different from the crude projectiles used by the World Eaters. These were precision instruments of war, guided by machine spirits blessed by the finest tech marines in the Imperium. They descended through Mortis Prime's toxic atmosphere like golden teardrops, each one carrying a tactical squad equipped with weapons that could level city blocks. Brother Captain Tycho was the first to emerge from his drop pod, his power armor gleaming crimson in the hellish light of the burning hive city. Through his helmet's auto-sensors, he could see the Hulk standing over Angron's prone form, the green giant's chest heaving with exertion that seemed more psychological than physical. The readings his armor's sensors provided defied belief. Muscle density beyond any known biological limits, cellular regeneration that operated faster than their equipment could measure. And most disturbing of all, psychic emanations that registered as pure, undiluted rage. "Target acquired," he reported across the tactical network, engaging with maximum force. The Blood Angels' assault was a masterpiece of coordinated warfare. Bolter rounds filled the air like a steel rain, each shot precisely calculated to maximize damage while minimizing collateral destruction. Plasma guns spat superheated death while melter weapons unleashed fusion fire hot enough to melt through tank armor. For a moment, the Hulk disappeared behind a wall of explosions and energy discharges. When the smoke cleared, he was still standing. His skin was scorched, his clothing reduced to tatters, but the wounds were already healing at a rate visible to the naked eye. More importantly, the assault had done exactly what every previous attack had accomplished. It had made him angrier. The roar that erupted from the Hulk's throat was unlike anything the Blood Angels had ever heard. It contained harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical, creating psychic shockwaves that overloaded their helmet sensors and sent several battle brothers to their knees. Brother Captain Tycho felt his twin hearts skip beats as the sound washed over him like a physical force. "Emperor, preserve us," he whispered into his vox bead. "What manner of daemon have we encountered?" The answer came from an unexpected source. As the Hulk charged toward the Blood Angel's position with earth-shaking strides, space itself seemed to fold around him. The warp energies that had been building throughout his rampage finally reached critical mass, tearing open rifts in reality that revealed glimpses of the immaterium beyond. Through these wounds in space-time, entities that had no business existing in the material universe began to seep through. But these were not the familiar daemons of the ruinous powers. The Hulk's rage had created something entirely new in the warp, a reflection of his gamma-powered fury that existed beyond the traditional hierarchy of chaos. These entities moved with purpose that defied classification, their forms shifting between states of matter and energy as they sought to merge with their physical counterpart. Brother Librarian Mephiston, the Blood Angel's chief librarian, felt the psychic disturbance like a knife blade scraping against his soul. His witch sight pierced the veils between dimensions, revealing truths that made his enhanced mind reel with horror. The Hulk was not just a powerful Xenos entity or mutant human. He was becoming something else entirely, a focal point where raw emotion took on independent existence. "Brothers, fall back," he commanded, his psychic voice cutting through the chaos of battle. "This creature is not what it appears to be. It is becoming a conduit for forces beyond our understanding." But retreat was not an option for the sons of Sanguinius. The Blood Angels had sworn oaths to protect humanity from all threats, Xenos or otherwise. They advanced with weapons blazing, their battle cries echoing across the ruined cityscape as they prepared to sell their lives dearly in service to the Emperor. The collision between Space Marines and the Hulk was like watching ceramite meet a force of nature. Power armor that had been crafted by master artificers and blessed by the finest tech priests crumpled under impacts that registered on orbital sensors. Weapons that could cut through tank armor barely scratched gamma-irradiated skin. And through it all, the Hulk's strength continued to grow, fed by the violence around him and the dimensional energies pouring through the warp rifts his presence had created. Brother Captain Tycho found himself face to face with the Green Giant as his squad was scattered by a single sweep of a massive arm. Up close, he could see that the creature's eyes held more than just rage. There was intelligence there, buried beneath layers of fury and confusion, something almost human. "What are you?" he asked, his voice carrying through his helmet's external speakers. The Hulk paused for a moment, his head tilting as if struggling to process the question. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones of pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. "Hulk was." The Green Giant's massive hands pressed against his temples, as if trying to squeeze out memories that wouldn't come. "Banner." Hulk remembers Banner. Before Tycho could respond, the moment was shattered by a new arrival. The air above them split open with a sound like reality screaming, and through the dimensional rift stepped a figure that made even the daemon Primarch Angron seem small by comparison. This was no servant of chaos, no product of the warp's twisted imagination. This was something older, something that had existed in the spaces between realities since before the birth of stars. The entity spoke in a voice that bypassed sound entirely, communicating directly through psychic resonance that made every living being within 1,000 kilometers clutch their heads in pain. The barriers weaken. The experiment proceeds as calculated. Subject designation, Hulk entity, prepare for dimensional analysis. Suddenly, the true scope of what was happening became clear. The Hulk's arrival in this reality had not been an accident. He was part of something larger, a cosmic experiment being conducted by entities whose motivations remained utterly alien to human understanding. The destruction on Mortis Prime was not random violence, but data collection. The battles with Imperial forces were not conflicts, but tests. And now, as more dimensional rifts began opening across the planet's surface, it became apparent that the Hulk was not the only subject in this experiment. Through the tears in space-time came glimpses of other realities, other versions of familiar universes where different variables had been introduced, a reality where the Tyranids had evolved psychic abilities, a dimension where the Emperor had never been wounded during the Horus Heresy, a universe where humanity had never discovered the warp at all. The implications were staggering. If these entities could manipulate the barriers between realities at will, if they could introduce elements from one universe into another as easily as a tech priest might install a new cogitator component, then the very concept of dimensional stability was an illusion. The grimdark universe of Warhammer 40,000 was not an isolated pocket of reality, but part of a vast multi-dimensional experiment whose scope dwarfed even the ambitions of the Chaos Gods. On the bridge of his flagship, Captain Kane watched the developing situation with growing dread. His exterminatus weapons were armed and ready, but would planet-killing warheads even matter against entities that could step between dimensions through a door, as easily as walking? The tactical displays showed dimensional rifts opening across Mortis Prime's surface, each one disgorging phenomena that defied classification. "Sir," his astropath reported, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining contact with the fleet, "I'm receiving transmissions from across the sector. Similar dimensional anomalies are manifesting on 17 different worlds. The pattern suggests coordination." Kaine closed his eyes and made the hardest decision of his career. Signal the Inquisition, maximum priority. Tell them we need everything they have. This is beyond a simple Xenos incursion. But even as astropathic messages raced across the galaxy, calling for aid from the Imperium's most secretive organizations, the situation on Mortis Prime was evolving in ways that no human doctrine could address. The Hulk stood at the center of a growing maelstrom of dimensional energy, his gamma-powered form serving as an anchor point for forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The entity that had spoken earlier materialized more fully, its form shifting between states of matter as it studied the green giant with what might have been scientific curiosity. Other beings began to emerge from the dimensional rifts, each one representing a different aspect of the cosmic experiment that was unfolding across multiple realities simultaneously. And in the depths of space, ancient sensors that had remained dormant for millions of years began to stir. The Necrons, those deathless machine beings who had once ruled the galaxy before the rise of organic life, detected the dimensional disturbances with equipment that operated on principles beyond current Imperial understanding. In tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy, Necron lords began to wake from their great sleep. Their artificial minds calculating the threat these reality-manipulating entities might pose to their plans for galactic dominion. The Hulk had arrived in Warhammer 40,000 as a single anomalous individual, but his presence had triggered something far larger, a cascade of events that threatened to reshape not just one universe, but the entire structure of reality itself. And as the dimensional barriers continued to weaken around Mortis Prime, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a crisis that would test every faction in the galaxy to their absolute limits. The Necron tomb ship Time's Eternal Dominion Times translated into real space with the silence of death itself, its black stone hull drinking in the light of distant stars. Lord Illuminor Ceres stood upon the command deck, his mechanical form hunched over instruments that had calculated the orbits of galaxies when humanity was still learning to make fire. The dimensional distortions emanating from Mortis Prime registered on sensors that operated beyond the crude understanding of organic science. "Fascinating," the cryptech murmured through vocal synthesizers that had not spoken in 65 million years. The barriers between realities exhibit unprecedented instability. The organic specimens appear to have triggered something far beyond their comprehension. Behind him, ranks of Necron warriors stirred from their dormancy, their Gauss weapons powering up with the distinctive whine of technology that had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe. These were beings who had once battled the star gods themselves, who had witnessed the birth and death of entire galactic civilizations. Yet even they had never encountered dimensional manipulation on this scale. On Mortis Prime, the Hulk's rampage had evolved into something far more complex than simple destruction. The dimensional entities surrounding him began to conduct what could only be described as live experimentation, introducing variables that defied every known law of physics. Reality warped around the green giant like clay in the hands of a sculptor, each modification producing effects that rippled outward through space and time. The Imperial forces found themselves fighting not just the Hulk, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. Gravity reversed in localized pockets, causing battle brothers to fall upward into the toxic sky. Time flowed backward in some areas while accelerating to impossible speeds in others. Brother Captain Tycho watched in horror as one of his tactical squads aged centuries in seconds, while another became trapped in temporal loops that repeated the same moment of combat endlessly. "This is not warfare," Librarian Mephiston transmitted across the chapter's psychic network, his mental voice strained with the effort of maintaining coherent thought in the dimensional chaos. "This is vivisection on a planetary scale." The entities conducting the experiment seemed to take particular interest in how different forms of life responded to the reality distortions. They observed the Space Marines' enhanced physiology with clinical detachment, noting how their additional organs and genetic modifications reacted to temporal displacement. The surviving PDF troopers provided baseline human data, while the few remaining tech priests offered insight into the fusion of organic and mechanical components. But it was the Hulk himself who remained the primary focus of their attention. Each measurement they took, each dimensional probe they deployed, only seemed to make him stronger. His rage was no longer purely emotional. It had become a fundamental force, like gravity or electromagnetism, that shaped reality through sheer intensity of will. In the eye of terror, the Chaos Gods themselves paused in their eternal scheming to observe this unprecedented development. Tzientch's crystalline towers shifted and reformed as the great conspirator attempted to incorporate these new variables into his infinite calculations. But for the first time in eons, the Lord of Change found his foresight blocked by something that operated outside the normal flow of cause and effect. Intriguing. The Changer of Ways mused, his voice echoing through dimensions that mortal minds could not perceive, a force that exists beyond prediction, immune to the very concept of fate itself. Nurgle, the Plague Father, felt the dimensional disturbances as disruptions in the natural cycle of decay and renewal. His garden realm, where entropy had been cultivated into an art form, experienced spontaneous reversals of decomposition as reality-altering energies leaked through the barriers between dimensions. Diseases that had festered for millennia suddenly found themselves cured, while healthy organisms spontaneously developed new forms of corruption that defied biological classification. Slanesh, the Prince of Excess, experienced the chaos as a symphony of sensations beyond any previous pleasure or pain. The dimensional experiments created new forms of experience that transcended the traditional boundaries of sensation, offering glimpses of realities where the very concept of feeling had evolved along different paths. But it was Khorne who felt the most profound impact from the unfolding events. The Hulk's rage had become something that existed independent of normal emotional constraints, a pure expression of fury that needed no sustenance beyond its own existence. The Blood God's realm trembled as this gamma-powered wrath created resonances in the immaterium that threatened to upset the delicate balance between the ruinous powers. On Terra, in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, ancient systems that had remained sealed since the Horus Heresy began to activate. The Emperor's psychic presence, normally focused on maintaining the Astronomicon and holding back the forces of chaos, turned its attention to this new anomaly that threatened the stability of reality itself. Through the golden corridors of the palace, Custodes moved with unprecedented urgency. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood before the sealed gates of the Eternity Gate, his auramite armor reflecting the ethereal light that bled through dimensional barriers weakened by events half a galaxy away. "My lord," he spoke into the psychic void, knowing his words would reach the master of mankind regardless of the physical barriers between them. "The dimensional integrity of our reality faces unprecedented threat. Your guidance is required." The response came not in words, but in visions that flooded the Captain General's enhanced consciousness. He saw the Hulk standing at the center of a multi-dimensional nexus, his gamma-powered form serving as an anchor point for entities whose motivations remained utterly alien. He witnessed realities colliding and merging, creating hybrid universes where the laws of physics operated according to principles that defied imperial understanding. Most disturbing of all, he glimpsed the true scope of the experiment being conducted. The entities manipulating dimensional barriers were not simply studying individual realities, they were testing the fundamental structure of existence itself. The Hulk was merely one variable in a cosmic equation whose solution could reshape the nature of reality across infinite dimensions. Back on Mortis Prime, the situation continued to deteriorate as more dimensional rifts opened across the planet's surface. Through one came a squad of space marines whose armor bore heraldry from a chapter that had been declared lost in the warp 3,000 years ago. Through another emerged a pack of orcs, whose technological innovations operated on principles that made even the most heretical tech priest weep with envy. The Hulk moved through this chaos like a green hurricane of destruction, his presence causing reality to bend and warp around him. Where his feet touched the ground, the very atoms rearranged themselves according to laws that existed in universes where gamma radiation had evolved as a fundamental force rather than a byproduct of nuclear decay. Brother Captain Tycho found himself separated from his squad by a dimensional rift that had opened directly between them. On the other side, he could see his battle brothers engaging enemies that defied classification, creatures that seemed to be composed of living mathematics, entities that existed as pure concepts given physical form, beings that operated according to the laws of realities, where consciousness itself was a measurable physical property. "This is madness," he transmitted across the Vox network, his voice distorted by the dimensional interference that plagued all communications. "We are not fighting an enemy. We are being dissected by forces that view us as laboratory specimens." The dimensional entities seemed to take note of his observation, focusing their attention on the space marine with what might have been approval. One of them approached, its form shifting between states of existence as it studied Tycho through senses that operated beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. Specimen demonstrates cognitive awareness of experimental parameters. It communicated through direct psychic contact that bypassed his helmet's audio systems. Classification: enhanced human, subtype, Adeptus Astartes. Genetic modifications show promise for cross-dimensional stability testing. Before Tycho could respond, the entity reached out with appendages that existed in more dimensions than his enhanced vision could perceive. The touch was not painful, but it was wrong in ways that made his very soul recoil. He felt his genetic structure being analyzed at the molecular level, his memories being catalogued and cross-referenced against databanks that contained information from countless other realities. And there you have it. The Hulk didn't just rampage through Warhammer 40,000, he fundamentally broke it. What started as one angry green giant became a multidimensional crisis that threatened the very fabric of reality itself. From the Imperium's brutal calculus to the Chaos God's eternal schemes, every faction found themselves facing something they could never have prepared for. The grimdark universe met unlimited rage, and neither would ever be the same again.